Hi there everyone. In today's AP Economics for International Students, we're going to look at a macroeconomics question. This question's from 2017. It's the free response question, FRQ number 3. So this question combines two different parts. In fact, a third part could be added. It's not necessary, but we will have a look at it. First, we will look at the vocabulary, and then we will look at the questions. So I've highlighted the key words in the questions, the question stems here. So let's look at those first before we carry on. The question tells us that this country is at full employment and it produces two kinds of goods, consumer and capital goods. So let's have a look at those two ideas, the different types of goods and full employment. Okay, full employment means that the economy is operating with only frictional and structural unemployment. You may remember that from your unemployment and employment chapters. So this means the economy will be on the PPC, the production possibilities curve. It's also called the PPF, production possibilities frontier. It really depends which textbook you're using. You'll see both in exams. So you're going to be on the curve, not inside or obviously not outside that curve, which we will draw in a second. The two types of goods, very important for both micro and macro questions. You'll see this question commonly in multiple choice and in free response questions on both exams for AP. Consumer goods are goods that are consumed or used by the end user. Capital goods are goods that are used to make, to produce other goods. You have to be very careful with this word capital. Look at the context to understand, are we talking about money? Are we talking about equipment? Here it's equipment, things like factories, machines, robots, and so on. An example here would be if you buy a computer, if that computer is just for your own entertainment, your own use at home, that is a consumer good. However, if you use that same computer and you take it to your office or your factory, or you use it to produce some goods or services, then it is a capital good. So a capital good is a good that is used to produce other goods. Let's look at the first part of the question here. It says to draw a correctly labeled graph of the production possibilities curve with consumer goods on the horizontal axis. Horizontal means the x-axis, so left to right, horizontal. Horizon, maybe you know that word, what you see in the distance, and it should be from left to right, usually. Capital goods should be on the vertical. Vertical means the y-axis, the up and down axis on your graph. Indicate just means show a point on your graph. Label, so label just means to write it, to indicate it. Labeled X that represents full employment. So you have to decide where on your PPC, where on this graph you're going to put it. And you need a possible combination. So combination means sum of both. So you can't be at the extreme on the y-axis or on the x-axis. Anywhere in the middle is okay. All right, so let's draw that. So this is a very roughly drawn PPC graph, or production possibilities frontier. We've got our capital goods, I just wrote cap, on the vertical up and down axis, the y-axis, and our consumer goods on the x-axis, the horizontal axis. Okay, notice my PPC, this curve here, it's bowed out. Okay, so this word here, bowed out, is, it means that it's not a straight line, and it tells us we have rising opportunity cost as we move from one axis to the other along the PPC. Okay, now my X here is located on the curve itself. Okay, why did I put it there? Because it tells us the country is at full employment. Okay, if we're at full employment, we can be anywhere along this curve. It means we're using all of our resources efficiently. Nothing is wasted. If we had unemployment, we would be inside the curve here. And outside the curve is not possible with the resources as they currently exist in this situation in this question. Now, the next part of the question asks us to think about a different graph, but we're going to come back to this graph here. So that's why I put my X a little bit further towards the consumer goods on the x-axis than the capital goods. We'll see that in a second. Okay, so let's look at the vocabulary in part B. It says assume. So assume here just means imagine or take for granted. So assume there is an increase in the country's national savings. Okay, as soon as you hear those words or see those words, you know you're going to be looking at one of our loanable. It's going to be loanable funds or the money market. Okay, and in this case, it's the loanable funds market, which they tell us. And the national savings is how much the country as a whole is saving. Okay, so we're going to draw that in a second. And it says, draw a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market showing the change in the real interest rate. So they've told us there how to label our market graph, which is very helpful. From the increase in savings. Okay, we've got an increase in savings, so we're going to be drawing that on our loanable funds market. So let's do that, and we're going to leave this graph here because we're going to come back and use it again for part C. Now we can look at the loanable funds market graph here on the right. Okay, so what we have here, we've got real interest rate on the y-axis. They've told us, very helpful, that the real interest rate is the relevant one. It's not nominal for this graph. And quantity of loanable funds, I just wrote QLF down here because I'm not very good at drawing with this pad yet. So the starting point, we would just draw the demand curve here and the supply curve here. Okay. Then it's really important to label, okay? Use dotted lines to label your starting interest rate. I called it R1, you can call it just R or whatever you like. And Q1 or Q tells us the starting quantity. Now this is useful because it helps us to determine what has changed, what has gone up, what has gone down. So the question tells us there's an increase in the country's national savings. So if there's an increase in savings, that's an increase in supply. So that means our supply curve is going to shift to the right. Okay, so I've got SLF1, LF is for loanable funds. Also, I've drawn an arrow here. It's really important to draw arrows on these graphs just to help the reader, the marker, to understand what's going on. And if you do make some mistakes, then the arrows can help him or her to interpret what you've written. Okay, so you can see the interest rate has fallen down to R2, which is going to be very important to answering the rest of this question. And quantity has increased from Q1 to Q2. So looking at this, the takeaway here is this change in the interest rate. Okay, we need to think about what effect is that going to have on consumers and on businesses. Okay, so for interest rate sensitive consumption, that is things like what's called big ticket items. That could be things like cars, I don't know, washing machines, expensive things that people often borrow money for. I don't know, boats maybe. However, another more important part of aggregate demand that's going to be affected here is investment. Okay, so investment will increase if interest rates are lower because the cost of borrowing is lower. It's cheaper to borrow. You don't have to pay so much when you pay it back. This means that more projects become viable. Viable means feasible, kind of like possible. Okay, so if it's cheaper to borrow money, that means that projects that before were not considered so great become acceptable. Okay, so this is going to increase investment, which is going to help us with the next part of our question, part C. The last part of the question doesn't require us to actually draw the ADAS graph, but it's useful to have it to understand what's going on. So it says, referring to your answer to part C, so we know that we've moved along the PPC to a location on the curve that's closer to the capital goods on the y-axis. That tells us that we're increasing the long-run potential of the economy to produce goods and services. And that would be indicated on an ADAS graph by a shift to the right of the LRAS, the long-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so now you don't need to draw this for this question, but this is what it would look like. So I drew it rather roughly here. We've got our price level on the y-axis, our real GDP or output on the x-axis. We know from the question that we're starting out in equilibrium at full employment. At least I think that's what it said. And why would it shift out to the right here? Well, we know that we've got more capital goods, and that is one of the factors that can increase long-run aggregate supply. Okay, so the key words you would want to include in your answer here, and it says explain, so it's not enough just to say it's going to shift it to the right. Well, lower interest rate leads to higher investment. Greater investment means more what's called capital formation. You might also see things like capital accumulation. Basically the same meaning, for at least for this question. So capital formation, let me just write that down here. Capital formation. Capital accumulation. Whoops. You'll see them in many questions, both of these in macro. So if you had to draw an ADAS graph, which is not unusual, you would want to draw something similar to this. Depends on the requirements of the question. So that completes this 2017 FRQ number 3. Reviewing the vocabulary, full employment tells us that we are in equilibrium on our ADAS, or we're on our PPC. Remember, these two are related. Consumer goods, those are goods or services that are for final consumption, final use. Capital goods are goods, things like equipment that's used to make consumer goods. The PPC is also called the PPF. Horizontal means left to right or the x-axis. Vertical is the y-axis. The national savings rate, if we increase this, we're going to be shifting our supply curve to the right. The effect of that is going to be to reduce interest rates. The real interest rate, which is how we're going to answer the last two parts of this question. And that means that we're moving up the curve here, and that means we're going to have greater investment, greater long-run aggregate supply, LRAS, on your graph if you have to draw it. Now you don't have to draw it, in fact don't. It just says to explain. When it says explain, they're talking about words, not graphs. But if you did have to draw a graph, it would look something similar to this. So there's a very brief summary of this question. It's not a very difficult question, but it does bring together a number of concepts that you will see in more demanding questions. The FRQ number 1, for example, that can have 5 or 6 parts to it. So I hope that was helpful, and make sure you understand this vocabulary. You'll see it in so many questions. Try to learn some synonyms, practice it, and you will be able to use it effectively, whether you're taking AP, where you don't usually have to write very much, or you're taking A-level or some other course where you may have to write a lot more. In future videos, we'll look at full employment. What is it? How is it calculated? And also things like real and nominal interest rates and some of the other concepts that are included in this question. It's worth noting that a lot of this vocabulary here is not limited to economics. If you look at it, you'll see that other than maybe long-run aggregate supply and a couple of other words, all of the vocabulary in this question could be helpful for your TOEFL, your IELTS, your ACTs and your SATs, and indeed any other class. So that's it for today. So I hope this was helpful again, and have a great week. Bye for now.